Last week, a ground-penetrating radar scan found the bodies of 115 children in a mass grave unmarked near Kamloops, BC, in Canada. Without context, this would have been international news. Is this a mass murderer, a serial killer, or some sort of massacre? In context, though, it barely made the front pages of the papers initially until public outrage caused it to be more public. This was the site of a former residential school. But it's not really a school. It's not a school as you might think of it. It's an implement of Canada's genocide of its indigenous peoples. Apologists over the years have tried to diminish the significance of this residential school program as being just some way that the white man was helping the indigenous peoples of this country. But no, this is genocide, pure and simple. And no, it's not cultural genocide, as has been acknowledged by some previous governments. Genocide is the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a racial, ethnic, cultural, religious, or national group. And that's exactly what's happened in Canada. We have attempted to destroy our indigenous peoples over many centuries in order that the white people, the colonizers, become the dominant race, such that the indigenous people are dispossessed of their nation, of their land. To understand why and how, we need to understand Canada as a whole. Canada is a settler nation. It's a colonial empire, so to speak. It's founded by white Europeans, by English and French people mostly, on indigenous land. When the settlers showed up here, indeed it was a settled place already. There were indigenous peoples, thousands of different cultures and languages and distinct groups living across North America with their own distinct established cultures. And when the white Europeans showed up, they attempted to remove the indigenous peoples such that they could take over the land to build their own empires. It's easy to think that Canada was better than the United States, but this is largely due to Canadian mythology. The mythology of us being nice and polite makes it actually harder to see the atrocities in our past and present, and thus harder to address those atrocities. Our founding leaders, particularly our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, were rabidly racist against Indigenous peoples. They saw them as subhuman, as savages. They negotiated a truce between English and French peoples such that this could become a multicultural nation, but excluded from that multiculturalism were all the Indigenous peoples. They were systematically excluded and intended to be dispossessed of their land. They were intending to exterminate non-settler inhabitants of this land through intentional starvation, forced migration, prohibition of trade with settler settlements, poisonings, systematic abduction, like this residential school program, or just outright mass murder. The list goes on and on and on, and I can't really go through an exhaustive list of the atrocities committed because I don't even know all of it. It's impossible to recount a history like that, and frankly, I'm just too hurt by it to even think about. But we have to press on here. The residential school program was one implement of this genocide. But to be clear, this isn't really a school, not a school in the way that we normally think of them. This is more like an internment camp for children. And to be clear as well, this isn't just the rogue act of religious extremists or some other group of horrible people. This was an officially sanctioned government act. This was a policy by the Canadian government designed intentionally to kill the Indian, save the man, to exterminate native culture, to exterminate the indigenous peoples by taking their children away from their culture, removing that culture, and making good little Western subjects. This, of course, was sold with the noblest of intentions to rescue native children from their backwards people and give them a proper upbringing and education. But yes, the real aim here was to destroy indigenous culture on a generational basis by preventing indigenous children from becoming indigenous adults and indigenous elders and thus passing forward their culture to the next generation. How this worked was basically forced abduction by separating children from their parents, from their communities, taking them often hundreds of kilometers away from their homes, and putting them up in a boarding school with horrible conditions. Upon arrival, they would be forcibly denied their indigenous ways of life. They'd be stripped of their indigenous attire, their hair would be cut. Any mention of their language and their cultures, any practice of indigenous ways of life, any spiritual practices, would be harshly, severely punished. They would not be allowed to return to their homes or associate with any other members of their family. They would be basically punished arbitrarily. Horrible acts of physical, sexual, emotional abuse and violence, and awful conditions. Sanitation and nutrition were far below standard. Many children died of malnutrition, and if there was a disease outbreak of smallpox or any other of the illnesses of that age, many children would just simply die. And of course, there was very poor record keeping, so the true toll of these deaths were never really known. The remains of these children, once deceased, would never be returned to their parents, and in many cases, the parents would never even be told that their child had passed. And there are many, many horror stories of what happened in these residential schools. I'll leave it as an exercise to the viewer if you wish to look it up, but I warn you, it's pretty heavy stuff. I have broken down crying just reading about this stuff. Between medical experimentation, systematic abuse, just sadistic cruelty against innocent children whose only crime was to be of a different race, of practicing a different culture. And tragically, this system worked exactly as intended. The Indian was killed, the man was sometimes saved, and indigenous communities decayed. By not having a replacement population to come up in the next generation, many of these communities were thrown into a demographic crisis. Cultures were forgotten, languages died or are dying, and entire civilizations have just ceased to exist. And it's easy to consider this as just one horrifying, isolated incident, but no, this is a commonality. There are indigenous residential schools all across this country, and each one of them, more than likely, has a similar mass grave. And of course, there's been calls now to go searching at each site of these residential schools, and I'm sure more discoveries like these will be found. This truth was intentionally hidden, of course. There was very poor record keeping at most residential schools, and for this very reason, there was no real desire to track these people as individuals, as valid human beings. They were a fungible mass of children to be formed into proper Western subjects. And also, this mass grave is not new news. It is known, it has been known for quite some time, that these residential schools had a high rate of death, that many of them did have mass graves. It's just that now we have physical, visible evidence that this one exists, which suggests that many more exist, and they need to be found. They need to be acknowledged that this occurred. Particularly disturbing to me is that this isn't really part of the popular consciousness. Even though intellectually we know this, the information is there, for most people they don't really even consider this to be the case. I didn't learn this in school. I went through an entire elementary and high school education in Canada, didn't learn a word about the residential school program. Didn't even learn much about Indigenous history at all. Only the little snippets that were sanitized and whitewashed in order for white consumption. It wasn't until much later that I actually learned about the atrocities that have occurred in this nation throughout its history. All I really did receive in school was this narrative of the heroic white people and the Indian savages, which more damaging than anything to the culture. What really pisses me off about this current set of discoveries is that there are people trying to color this as a tragic part of our past. But it's not part of our past. It's part of our present and recent history. The last of these schools closed in 1994, within my lifetime. There are people, many people alive right now, who suffered at one of these facilities systematic, horrific trauma and abuse. Some people younger than I am are living victims of this abuse. And the people that have experienced this don't forget it easily. That kind of abuse, that kind of wound, that's permanent. One does not get over being systematically abused throughout their formative years. And for the people whose family members have been traumatized this way, it's very difficult to not visit that trauma on others. The amount of generational trauma and abuse, not intentionally wrought, but through having this post-traumatic stress disorder and the anxiety and the depression that comes with it and the desire to self-medicate that leads to addictive disorders. This causes untold harms to not only just the victims themselves, but everyone around those victims. And as such, this generational trauma is imparted upon indigenous people that had no part in the system itself. These things can't be healed simply by solving one individual. It becomes part of a community, part of a culture. The entire culture itself now is traumatized and needs to be healed. Now, thankfully, there's been some progress in recent years. There's been increased visibility and awareness of these horrible tragedies and increasing public support and understanding of the nature of Canadian society and what it means, as well as some affirmative action programs and certain compensatory measures and reparations having been paid. But it doesn't go far enough. These injuries can't simply be paid away. These things take time to heal, and a lot of effort, a lot of reconciliation needs to take place. The government of today, the Liberal government of Canada, has made a big show about apologizing and seeking justice, but the action just hasn't really matched the promises. There's been a promise made to get Indigenous communities clean drinking water. That was made several years ago now, and that still hasn't happened. Many are still under boil water advisory or do not drink advisories, and very little actual progress in getting water treatment equipment to those communities has actually taken place. All it would take is an investment of time and effort and money, and it's just not happening. But even when help does arrive, it often comes with these paternalistic attitudes, where the noble white man comes in to save these poor Indians from their fate. But all that does is make the problem worse. The management of settler culture, overriding the wisdom, the knowledge, the agency of indigenous cultures, means that it's just a culture of dependency. It's creating a culture of dependency such that never can indigenous cultures have their own agency, their own will to be the way that they are. Genocide comes in many forms, and this is a form of genocide. It is a way of robbing indigenous peoples of their agency, of their own self-determination, in order that they be subsumed, absorbed into settler culture. And what's more, Canadian culture at large contains genocidal attitudes. There's this mythology I mentioned of multiculturalism, but there's this implicit norm, this normal that comes along with the multicultural attitude that you have to assimilate. You have to be part of Western culture. You have to act like a normal white person. Normal white person. Notice the discourse there. White and Anglo is the yardstick to measure success, and anyone who doesn't measure up to that is a failure to meet this normal standard. And as such, someone who conforms to indigenous norms, someone who embraces indigenous culture, is a failure to be white, and as such is considered lesser than. These attitudes of, why can't they just fit in? Why can't they just get over it? And what's done is what's done. These things are part of this genocidal attitude. These things create this norm that denies indigenous peoples the validity of their way of life, of their own normal. And by failing to see the history, by failing to understand the structural and cultural and environmental factors that are at work affecting the people that have been victims of this genocide, we're oh so easy to see it as individual failures, that they're just lazy or drunks or hooligans or they're ungrateful or stupid or anything else like that. But what we're seeing as this epidemic of abuse, epidemic of depression and of addiction disorders, this is the result of post-traumatic stress disorder, of this generational trauma, of inadequate infrastructure and inadequate supports, a collapse of cultural traditions. Without a culture to create a shared reality for Indigenous peoples, it's impossible to live together as a whole people, and therefore it's impossible to create whole people themselves, whole agentic individuals. Obviously, we can't take back what's happened. What's done is indeed done, but we can work to fix it. As a white person, I have a complicated relationship to this country. There are many things that I am not proud about. Canada does have its good attributes, but its foundation is a shameful one, and its failure to acknowledge and address this shame, as well as the problems that still exist to this day, is one of the most shameful of all. This discovery of this mass grave has prompted calls to conduct more searches, and indeed these searches need to take place. But also, we need to give Indigenous people back their agency. This is part of the Land Back movement, where we, Canada, would cede territory back to Indigenous peoples, provide them with the agency to govern their own affairs. This doesn't mean, though, a reversal of fortunes. This doesn't mean that Indigenous peoples would be treating us how we've treated them. There is a certain amount of anger, and certainly it is justifiable, but Indigenous peoples are not seeking revenge. This isn't a matter of them punishing us for our sins or from the sins of our fathers. They're seeking justice, reconciliation. They're seeking to live in a world where they have the same agency that they deserve, that they can make their own decisions, that we can all be agentic beings in a shared place. More than anything else, Indigenous peoples need supported autonomy. We need to be providing the support necessary to build infrastructure, to solve the problems in Indigenous communities. But there needs to be agency given to Indigenous communities to lead themselves, with support as is necessary, but Indigenous peoples need to have control of their own lives, their own communities, their own world. And as a key component to this, Indigenous culture needs to be respected as valid, as worthy, as normal. Western society is all most of us, white settler people, have ever known, but parts of it are downright terrible. I don't like a lot of Western society. It's driven me crazy, for one. And for many Indigenous peoples, this is also their only experience. Despite being of Indigenous descent, they've never experienced anything other than Western society, settler society. They've been denied their heritage, a sense of belonging in their own communities, and even knowledge of their own way of life. This is not to say that Indigenous culture is inherently superior or other weird idealizations, but rather to acknowledge that this forcible erasure that's taken place has taken place, and it should be remedied. And it will require institutional responses, but it also requires individual responses. You ought to learn this history. You need to know what's happened. You need to know the legacy of what Canada means, what America means, what it means to be a citizen, a settler citizen of this society, and be aware of the ongoing story of oppression, and actively work against it in your life and in your world. Work against racism, work against the prejudice that comes along with interacting with Indigenous peoples, and dream of a day when we live in justice. Anyway, I make videos whenever I make videos. This one's been kind of hard, so it's taken a while. So if you enjoy this content, algorithmic stuff, and thanks for watching. See you later.